Mama, 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 lassie.
Hello. Is my mic on? Yes. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That's loud.
All right.
Sawubona mnumzane Olivier, mnumzane uVladimir Lenin Olivier
Lenin.
Ulinov.
Ulyanov fear. Ulyanov fear.
Have no fear.
I like that, actually. Let's go with that. From now on, I proclaim myself Mr. Ulyanov fear.
Not gonna end well.
Okay.
You know there's a war in that part of the world right now.
Is that? Putin. All right. Where did we end?
Lenin, April thesis. Yeah, around about there.
Did we discuss April thesis?
We touched on it, yeah,
We touched on it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Arrival of Lenin, Feb and March Revolution, April thesis. Yeah.
Okay.
That's about where we left off.
Where we left off. Yeah, so we said what? April thesis was all part of the... That's right, we discussed that. All part of the Soviets.
Yeah, boy.
Which is the big one. Peace, land, bread.
Which would have been all the failures of
provisional.
the outgoing provisional government.
Yeah. Well, yes, the failures of the 370 years of Romanov hierarchy, dynasty, but also the provisional government that didn't change it. And that was kind of a big thing because obviously Lenin was anti-bourgeoisie with his Russian Social Democrat Labor Party. Well, no, Bolshevik Party.
The majority party.
The majority party. And so, yes, they had a mission to remove that. So let's track our way. Provisional government is failing miserably. Nothing changes for the people. The people are after the honeymoon period of a revolution. It's exciting, but it doesn't change. It's still a bourgeois capitalist. Well, I say capitalist because there's no real capitalism in Russia at the time, but it's still a feudal system with a hierarchy, with elites. And the people are still miserable. They're still suffering during the war because they're still at war.
Yes.
Still in the war.
And maybe that's a good. I think let's clarify there. Maybe to give a bit more context to the April thesis. So the peace, bread, and the land. So peace, Russia is literally still engaged in war. Bread, famine. Land, the feudal model, which hasn't really been replaced officially by the provisional government.
Hasn't been replaced
at all. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So then the mission is to remove that, but Lenin is not ready. He's a very methodical man, and he wants a plan. He doesn't want to jump in on the excitement of the February Revolution and just sort of like blindly try and change things and take charge because he knows it'll fail. And I think that's probably most apparent in the July days. The sort of it's a brief period in July of 1917 where in the excitement and the turmoil of the provisional government, there's an uprising of the Bolshevik people, supporters, who have a very headless chicken attempt to take over. They fail miserably, and in fact, Lenin has to kind of go underground again because he's associated. He's the leader of the Bolsheviks, but he hasn't really got anything to do with it. And so, the July days is a failure, and it kind of pushes the Bolsheviks out of any, political scene. But then, when Kerensky, the leader at this point, Kerensky becomes the minister of the provisional government in July. I forget, is it Kornilov who's the military guy?
Yes. That would be
and
Kornilov.
so there's kind of there's an oncoming civil war of sorts between essentially the Kornilov faction, the Kerensky faction. And Kerensky calls on Lenin for help because he's got this large following. And so they provide the Bolsheviks with weaponry. Big mistake. The entire thing fizzles out.
Yeah.
and then the Bolsheviks and Lenin are armed.
They are armed and influential.
Exactly. And so this leads into the October Revolution. Now Lenin and his boys have had a chance to, plot and come up with a way. And so, the October Revolution is essentially Lenin and the Bolsheviks taking power, but it's a bloodless revolution. It's basically a matter of a very weakened provisional government who have no support. And Lenin just plots this essential sort of walk into the Winter Palace. I think they took charge of like banks and bridges and infrastructure in general.
Yeah, means of production, yeah.
Yeah, but without any real opposition. And then they march into the Winter Palace and they just, take over, arrest everyone, and there you go, and that's it. And so, at that point, essentially the Bolsheviks and Lenin are in charge. January 1918 is an election. They don't win a majority of any sort, 20-something percent, 26%, 3%, whatever it was, of the vote. The Mensheviks got like 3%, very, very low. But the sailors, the Kronstadt Sailors, who were, probably the biggest supporters of Bolshevism, as Lenin called them, the reddest of the red, marched into the Duma, I think it was the Duma anyway, marched into the building where the election was taking place, fired a few shots randomly, nearly killing a few people, and said, right, meeting adjourned, thank you very much.
We'll take it from here.
Yeah, and so essentially from that point you have, not yet, not a Bolshevik dictatorship, but they've put themselves in charge. It's not a dictatorship, and I would argue that because when you look at this topic and you look at, a general question, certainly essay question on Lenin would be, essentially to what extent was he successful in implementing communism?
Yeah.
Or at least communism in its purest form? And the answer is not at all purest form. Did he maintain control? Yes. So at first, there is success because he does, sign the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which has amendments, and then obviously when the war ends, that kind of is nullified. But it signs over everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the biggest problems.
Very controversial, yeah.
Yeah, it signs over like 80% of their coal production or something. And
also arable land.
Yeah, arable land.
Over to Germany. In a Russia that is plagued by famine at that particular time,
which is very important.
Yeah.
And all of the industry, like a ton of industry, I think 50% or something was gone.
So you have peace, but more suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. He does allocate land. He and very violently removes the elite, removes the nobility, the church, destroys churches, takes, possesses, expropriates land, kills a lot of people. A lot of people die in that moment. Nobility, clergy, and the peasants are given land, and by being given land, they can farm and they can make bread. So peace, bread, or peace, land, bread, in that order, I guess. But it doesn't last long. It doesn't last long because...
So it goes back to our conversation on inequality and equality. Are those even natural? So you have a lot of people who feel as if this is justice. We finally have land. Made sense in that context where there is greater suffering, but you also have a whole group of people who are also losing. They're losing land ownership. They're losing power and influence, and there's bound to be retaliation.
Yeah, I mean, even that, your nobility, clergy, and landowners in that category are a small number.
Yes.
In Russia at this point. But there are enough people to not want that. The fact that the Bolsheviks only wanted 23 whatever percent, that's a fifth, close to a quarter of the population, which means that everyone else, well, not the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks did support the Bolsheviks in the Civil War. But everyone else who was anti-Bolshevik essentially
Yeah.
went to war with him. And so you end up with a civil war starting at sort of the end of 1917, really, in certain parts, and carrying on until, well, technically 1921, end of 1921-ish, but some argue that it went on to like 1929 in certain factions in the massive Russian Empire. So yeah, three years of civil war following almost immediately after World War One. So you do see these kind of levels of absolute destruction, and that obviously brings us to, well, what happens during the Civil War? How does Lenin and how do Lenin and the Bolsheviks counter this problem?
About what? War communism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have war communism, essentially to aid the Red Army. So the Red Army would have been what? Well, predominantly the Bolsheviks.
Well, the Red Army is the Bolshevik army.
It's the Bolsheviks.
Led by old
and what do
Leon.
they do? What makes war communism so controversial, especially in terms of the greater population or seizure of crops?
Probably the most
harvest,
significant
yeah.
policy.
And war communism is also very interesting when you consider the main essay focus here. Was Lenin successful because in implementing communism? Because it will undo whatever gains that Lenin had already attained by that point. Because he is reintroducing war. Or creating an environment where war is most likely a probable outcome. But also in a sense contributing to food insecurity by those seizures. Felt entitled to it in the name of empowering the Bolsheviks, for the greater good of the nation. But in essence, it led to the very same outcome to which he had promised the Russian population he would sway them away from.
Yeah, I mean, food requisitioning, taking food from the peasants to feed the Red Army, to feed the Bolshevik army, to feed the small group of proletariat in the cities to produce weaponry and ammunition and such.
Creating another version of a class struggle, essentially. You're prioritizing the needs of some at the expense of others, which is precisely the regime they had, the Russian public had just overthrown.
And it's, I mean, that's a big contributing factor to the famine. Aside from, yes, there were actually droughts and whatnot, or low harvest, I don't know if it was droughts or extreme cold, but whichever, it led to poor harvests between 21 and 22 towards the end of it. I think that's an interesting point to touch on, because you're talking about, so again, success. Is he successful in implementing communism? Now, that has to be qualified. What do we mean by that? Did he retain power as a communist party? Quote. Yes. So war communism, if you argue its main purpose, to win the civil war and retain power and not to essentially reverse the revolution. Very successful, incredibly successful. Successful in implementing communism in its true form? No, not even close, because as you said, there's the reintroduction of a class system, and not just creating, a sort of or prioritizing the proletariat and feeding the army and that. And yes, that is a factor. But in essence, by this point, how has he done this? He's had to retract power to the Soviets, which he originally gave when he gave land, etc. So he removed power from the Soviets. It became the dictatorship, not of the Soviets, but a dictatorship of the Bolsheviks and Lenin. And so he's created what amounts to an autocratic system, back to the old hierarchy. He has created a class system, and those who are Bolshevik and support him are favored. This is enforced through his secret police, the Cheka. Obviously, the Cheka are a pivotal part of this terror, this red terror that ensues. The Cheka are the ones who will go out and, the commissars and confiscate the grain, the surplus, supposedly. But, where people were now rebelling against that and burning their own crops and such, by 1921 and whatnot, they were punished severely, sent to gulags, murdered. Entire villages were burnt to the ground. Seed was for the next harvest was confiscated, and so they would starve because they didn't have seed to plant for the next harvest. So yeah, you had a very what's the word? A kind of a state, police state, where there was no. Also, look at the industry. Strikes were banned. Very strict controls, militant controls. Obviously, it's socialism. Everything is nationalized. All business is nationalized. So yeah, war communism is incredibly strict. It allows no freedom of the people. It's a part of the reason for famine. It destroys the economy. The economy is absolutely. If you look at pre-war, pre-First World War, 1913 figures of production of coal, of whatever, pig iron, grain, etc., and then you look at sort of 1921 figures. It's horrific. It's
sharp decline,
massive decline, and accounts for all the economic decline and the famine. So yeah, war communism is an absolute disaster. The Chequer have instilled fear in the people, the Red Terror. Leon Trotsky is an academic, but a very beloved leader of the Red Army. Those who support him and those who go against him tend to die. Let's look at the Reds and the Whites. Where does that come from? The Red Army is obviously the Red.
Bolsheviks, yeah.
Which symbolizes essentially revolution, because if you look at, I think the Bolsheviks pulled that from the French Revolution, where the red flag represented the revolutionaries and the white represented the anti-revolutionaries, counter-revolutionaries. So it was sort of a name applied to the whites by the Bolsheviks, who were everyone else. Essentially,
yeah.
It wasn't like wasn't necessarily an anti-communist group. It was everyone who didn't want the Bolsheviks and Lenin in power. So
it's like it's us against everybody else, which then leads us to what? NEP.
Well, let's just touch maybe on the Kronstadt Sailors first, because I think that's as we said, the reddest of the red, and it becomes sort of the third, well, technically fourth revolution, if you consider the 1905 revolution as the first. But anyway, in this period, you got the February spontaneous revolution, which removes the Tsar, leads to the provisional government, the return of Lenin. October revolution, where Lenin takes power, Bolsheviks take power. And then you have, by the end of this, now the Kronstadt Sailors, kind of touched on this in the last episode, were, elite sailors, Marine, whatever you want to call them. They weren't Navy SEALs because it's Russia, but they're the Navy, who are very well trained, very disciplined, but also very resentful of that system, very oppressive system. They would be punished harshly on the little island of Kronstadt off the coast of Russia, and they'd be put in like little detention cells, isolation for whatever misdemeanors in their militant kind of environment. And so there was a lot of that resentment, and when this revolution happened in February, they mutinied. They shot their officers, and they were the first amongst Bolshevik support who kind of almost helped this February revolution to happen. And so they were very keen. When the Civil War broke out, they were like a very important force in that Red Army helping. Well, I don't know if you'd call them part of the Red Army, but they were certainly fighting with the Red Army. And they started to realize, because they're just normal people, they're peasants, and they were hearing stories from the land situation, and kind of getting intel about their families starving and the famine and all that, getting letters. And so they, obviously decided, well, let's win this war, because we don't want to go back to the old ways. We're still Bolshevik supporters, and we love that ideology. But at the end of it, they rise up.
Yeah.
And so you have the Kronstadt uprising, rebellion, which is, I don't remember how long it lasts, about 6 months or something. where they hold out against the Bolsheviks, but obviously when the sea freezes over in winter, the Bolshevik army can move across and eventually drives them out. There's a massive massacre of about 10,000 fleeing Kronstadt sailors. The point is, the biggest supporters, if you're assessing success and failure, the biggest supporters, the reddest of the red, who had supported the Bolsheviks, turned on Lenin because he wasn't living up to his promises.
Yeah.
Because that whole promise of power to the Soviets, they were the first to form a Soviet on a very disciplined kind of note, having meetings every day at noon and whatnot, running things very smoothly, being disciplined military. And so they turn on him, and they end up losing this sort of fourth revolution, driven into the forests of Finland across the sea and massacred in the forest. So yeah, I think that at that point, Lenin, so he's won, he's saved the revolution.
Yeah.
He's won the civil war.
Essentially destroying the revolution in the process. Yeah.
Destroying everything that he had ideologically put forth. And so, yeah, something has to change. Something has to give. Economically, everything is destroyed. A lot of people are sort of not happy with the situation. And
would you say Lenin's change of heart, so moving away from war communism to the new economic policy, was a moral decision, or was it him buckling under the pressure of public distrust, disapproval, frustration, etc.?
I think it's self-preservation. I think it's an element of he has no choice. He gets criticism from either way. By turning to the new economic policy, he's highly criticized by the old sort of guard of communist revolutionaries, because as we'll discuss, it's sort of a step back into capitalism. He's selling out. But economically, you'd be a fool if you hadn't done that. If he had carried on and just said, "Well, we're going to push through," and did those who implemented war communism, did they do it as a policy of we think the economy is going to grow, or did they do it as a policy of, okay, we need to save the revolution and defeat the whites? I think the latter. I don't
Most
think.
likely, yeah.
I mean, I don't think it was an economic plan to increase produce, because that, if that was your plan, well, you're the worst economist the world has ever seen. And it does fail miserably, but it does succeed in its purpose of saving the revolution, of winning the war. That's all it does. There's nothing else that it achieves. So yeah, I think the new economic policy is an absolute. There's no way around that. I don't think that they have a choice. But obviously ideologists are ideologists. And so he will have criticism. So new economic policy.
Yeah, granting peasants a bit of control over land, produce, being able to sell your surplus, make a bit of money, stimulate the economy, at least stabilize the basic needs that people have. Essentially capitalism.
Yeah.
It's essentially granting people a bit of private ownership. It wasn't total.
Well, they did go back to small, certainly small industry. So any light industries were allowed to be privately owned. All heavy industry remained state. It's a socialist government.
Yeah.
Which is normal for that situation. But I think key point, so yes, there's an element of capitalism with that, but also, like, how did we define communism? So again, extent of success. He reintroduces a class system.
Yes.
Because if you can own and sell and make money, you are creating...
Accumulate wealth. Yeah. And there's still going to be poor people, obviously.
Yeah. And so you have the class of the kulaks and the netmen. Yeah. So maybe define that. A kulak is what's a kulak? How would we define a kulak best?
So these would have been people who previously were marginalized, who didn't necessarily have access to any form of power, who now suddenly can accumulate wealth and a bit of status. Well, what would classify them as middle class? Certainly not upper class.
Well, we tend to use the term wealthy peasants, which is kind of a juxtaposition.
Yeah, I was avoiding that term. It's typically what I would say as well, wealthy peasants. But
I bring that up because especially under Stalin in the next segment, Stalin essentially creates the kulak myth because, yeah, okay, you can sell your surplus. Now, there's not a lot. They're paying a tax, and whatever surplus of produce they have, they can sell. We're talking about kulak specifically. They're not wealthy. They're
Yeah.
peasants who have a little more maybe than some who can't, whatever, successfully grow as much, whatever, like any farming community. And so they might have a little bit more. Maybe they've got one donkey and 2 cattle or something versus, the guy who has chickens and 1 cow. It's not a distinct class, and they probably live in the same community as the others. But certainly under Lenin, they had to create an enemy. Now, I'm not going to delve into that yet, but just in that sense of propaganda, the Stalin period exaggerates the kulak class. And I think that's where the term wealthy peasant comes from. I think it's a propaganda term that creates a villain, an evil capitalist, capitalist pig. And so, people need a villain if they are going to, run a nationalist cause in the case of Stalin. So yeah, on a very, very reductionist definition, they're wealthy peasants, but they aren't. They're people who have a little more than the others, very little more than the others, and they have the ability to sell some stuff. Net men, the men who benefit from the NEP, so in the market community, in the towns, merchants selling their goods in the market, which again creates a capitalist class. Those who can profit. Again, not necessarily wealthy merchants, but they can make some money. Either way, he's created a class system.
But I see why Stalin, as we will discuss in the next episode, I see why Stalin would have sort of created this counter-narrative that the kulaks are wealthy peasants, because the NEP under Lenin, in a way, was also an admission that communism is a failure, and so perhaps to re-own narrative, portray some in a negative light. So shift the goalpost. It's the reason why there is poverty, the reason why some are struggling is because they are greedy individuals within society who have exploited everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, that is the communist narrative in general, isn't it? That the exploitative class.
Yeah. It can't be the fact that as an ideology, communism itself is unattainable, practically at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, one has to take into account that this was a war-torn period. And so, famine in that is not purely from the war communist policies, but it certainly is a big factor. Bad harvests and war will do that. But it certainly didn't help. And then, the introduction of the NEP and that stimulus of the economy where people were actually getting paid in actual money, in rubles, as opposed to rations, of which there was very little. The upward turn of the economy is quite pronounced. Significant. It's very significant. And people start to, I wouldn't say prosper, but they certainly start to survive a lot better. I mean, there are many reports from foreigners who come to Russia at that point and say a marked improvement. So even Lenin says, as you say, this admission of the failure of communism, I don't know if I'd go that far. Certainly he wouldn't have said that. But he does say it's a step back to move 2 steps forward later. But again, the ideological communist hardliners won't hear of it, aren't impressed at all. So yeah, I mean, that essentially sums up Lenin and his reign, because NEP is introduced end of 21, 22, and then in 1924 the poor old fellow, he wasn't actually old, he was like, he was 53 or 54, I think. Wasn't much older than me. And he has a stroke, probably from all the stress and anxiety and a lifetime of battling away ideologies. Has a few strokes in that year, and then passes away in his will, to lead into the next segment. he states he doesn't think Stalin, as much as he loves him as a brother and a comrade, doesn't think he should take over because he's, a little ruthless.
Well, they used him to their own benefit.
Oh, yeah, Secretary General of the Communist Party. But yeah, he even states that it's probably not him. He probably there we go. We got that in. It's a sign. Yeah, he probably would have preferred Leon Trotsky.
Yeah.
But Stalin, in his wiles, a wily old fox, manages to manipulate his way in.
Booting Trotsky out in the process.
Yeah. I think that's a wrap.
Oh, yeah.
Let's wrap it.
Oh, the bell doesn't dismiss you.
Yeah.
I dismiss you.
You are dismissed.